The issue we're dealing with, first of all, was the ability to add something to our drop-down list on the fly, right? Because if we come in here, we've done all the work entering all this data up to that point and realize, oh, we forgot to add the new medical trial or add the new doctor, whatever, right? We could maybe choose something else like none if that's an option, or choose the wrong doctor and count on remembering to go back and choose the right one later. Because even if you came in here and went to maintain lookup values in a new tab or something, added the new medical trial, whatever, right? You can't come back here and refresh the page and have it available in the drop-down list without losing all the data you've entered so far, right? So that's kind of the issue we're going to address, first of all, in our work today, right? So I'm going to stop running for now. Okay, so as I say here, so now to step 23, quickly add lookup value to a drop-down list, okay? So you could do that kind of thing, go off somewhere else, navigate, but you can't add it without having to start over again, so to speak, on the current page. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to actually make it available in a modal pop-up. So you can follow along as we do this in code together. But I'll explain it in Visual Studio. It's a little easier to see what we're doing there. Now, just before I leave this controller, though, here's a bit of a tip. You saw a moment ago I had to actually, log in, right, before I could do anything. Well, that's great that we've added that to our system now, but during development, it's a bit of a pain in the rear end, right? So I thought I'd just share a bit of a trick that I often do with you, especially now that I got rid of that fallback policy of having everything locked down, right? Whether you put an authorized attribute or not. Now that we're relying on our authorized attributes, I can copy that, go Control H, and I could put in 2 slashes and authorize, and I could do that in the entire project, right? And then that would allow me to come in and do just about everything. Now, the only thing would be a complication is if I've got some code in place that, I had to be the one to create a record, before I could change anything. Well, that would kind of be an issue for that. But otherwise, just doing this quick change in the entire project would then take away the need to be logging in every time I want to do some testing of a new feature I'm working on, and so on and so forth. Now, I am going to do it right now just for the current document, just for the patient's controller, just to kind of show you what happens here. So there were 8 occurrences, 8 different authorized annotations put throughout, and I've commented them all out. So the next time I run, I actually won't have to log in if I just come to the patient's controller. I just wanted to share that little tip for you. So yeah, you can just do it throughout the entire project, and then a quick search and replace, searching for with the 2 slashes and take them out. You can put everything back again. All right, but let's get down into the actual work that we want to talk about today. So what we're going to do is we have a nice little JavaScript file that we're going to make use of on the client side that will look after going in the background without refreshing the whole page. Just refresh this little wee bit that we want, right? And just refresh our actual data in our select or drop-down list. So to add JavaScript, like we've done in the past, here in the www root, we go to the JS folder. Remember, we added this multi-select one. That was the one to help us to move the options back and forth between our 2 list boxes when we're doing that style of many-to-many. So in the same area, we're going to right-click. We're going to add a new file here. It'll be a new item. And I can find it right here. I think if I just scroll down, I should be able to find JavaScript. There we are. So it'll be a JavaScript file. This is one it's developed over a little while. I've been more or less reusing the same code, just added a few more features to it. I just call it refreshDDL, refresh drop-down list. Okay, so I'll just get my code. And let's just kind of have a discussion, talk about what this is actually going to do for us. Sorry, was there somebody had a question or comment? No, I thought I heard something. Never mind. Okay, so coming back over here, I've just thrown some comments at the top just to kind of describe it. Reusable, again, we're going to find you can reuse this multiple times in multiple spots and so on. Routine for select list, right? So this is going to be basically the ID of the select list. So for example, doctor ID, that might be the name, or the ID, I should say, that we give of a select list in our user interface, right? And usually we'll create in code a select list as an object using the same name, right? So that's what we put in as our first parameter. Then the URI, right? So that'll be like slash the controller name, slash the action name for going and getting. Now, here's the key point. We're not getting a whole view. We're just getting the actual data itself, the select list itself, in order to put that in place, right? The next is a Boolean show no data message, because it's possible we might go to get data, especially if there's some kind of a filter going on, right? And we might get no data returned. So we have a Boolean or not to, do we want to just, if we don't get any data, don't do anything? Or do we want to actually empty out the data from the select and show a message? If we're going to show a message, here we can pass a string, the message to actually show. They say no data was returned or whatever, right? Another Boolean, add default. We've seen this in practice quite a bit, that whenever we have a drop-down list, quite often at the top we'll put a little bit of a prompt, even like creating a new foreign key if it's required. Even still, we'll have it say something like select a, right, whatever it is, select a doctor or primary care physician, whatever, right? And then if we want that default to be added at the top, we say yes or no, and then we can provide the default text if it's going to be yes, right? The last one here, I just have in for fun. It's just a little bit of a visual animation, you might say, to actually make the element on the page, in this case, my drop-down list, just kind of quickly disappear and reappear again. So fade out and fade back in, right? We'll get down to the code when we get to it there. Okay, so that's the overall process. And once we have this in place, we learn how to reuse it multiple times all over our application. And all we really have to think about are the parameters that we pass in. But let's walk through the code at least once here. So the first thing we do is we go using the pound sign to indicate we're looking for an ID, right, of the drop-down list ID. So it might be, as I said, something like doctor ID, for example, right? And we grab that, okay, that reference to that object. Then this is the thing we're really doing. The getJSON method that's available inside jQuery, right, allows us to use a URI, send a request, and when the data is returned, let me emphasize again, we're just getting the data here, right? Not all the HTML, or even not like when we do a .load and we load a snippet of HTML to replace a section of the HTML of a page. No, we're just getting data, right? So we get the data returned. So the next line is to actually just check, did we actually get data back? Okay, there's two ways to do that just to be confident, right? That it's not null, and if we use our jQuery is object empty, that's a further check to make sure that we actually have something. It might be an empty object that isn't null, right? So that way we're covering all of our bases. Now, so if we got data, okay, then the next thing I do is I empty out whatever's in the DLL, or the drop-down list now, right? That's important because otherwise we would just get the new set of data and add it to whatever's there, so everything would be duplicated for the most part, right? So it's important we have to empty it out first. Then we start checking for these defaults. So if we want to have that default option at the very top, it might be something like none if it's a nullable foreign key, for example, or our usual prompt to say select something, right? Okay, so if our Boolean value here, add default, is true, okay, then we check for a default text. If we didn't get a value for default text, then we're just going to go with select, right? Select as a word at the top of the drop-down list. That's not so bad, okay, if we didn't get supplied anything else. Otherwise, then we append the value that we did pass in here, our default text, okay? So we just create an option tag. The value is an empty string, and the text is default text. Okay, all right. Next thing is we actually work with the data that was returned. So .each is basically a for each loop, right? Looping through the data. Okay, for each item, what are we going to do? Well, for each item, we will append an option tag, okay, to our select element, right? The value comes from the item's value. The display text, so to speak, comes from the text property of the item. And then there's a Boolean selected, okay? This is all coming basically from the properties of any select list as a data structure that we're passing back, right? So there's only be one selected usually, right? If it's a single select drop-down list, a select list, not a multi-select. So anything selected will be true or false. And so for this particular item, is this the one selected or not? And that's it. So that is all it takes to actually refresh it. So we have in here, we're triggering the updated event, okay? Basically, that's browser dependent. Most browsers don't even need that anymore, but it doesn't hurt having it here just for some older browsers that kind of want to be woken up and said, hey, guess what? We have updated this, so make sure you refresh it in the UI. Now, the else branch down here is what if there was no data returned, right? That brings us to this spot, okay? So then we check our other Boolean, show no data message, okay? So if that's, so if we got no data back, okay, so if show no data message is true, then we still empty out all the options out of the drop-down list, okay? And again, as long as we've been given a message, we show it, otherwise we say no matching data, right? And we append that as an option and away we go. Now, mind you, if our Boolean here is false, then it doesn't do anything. It leaves the original data in place. Okay, that's all the logic that really there is in here. Here's my little fun thing, my fade out in, okay? Fade toggle is just built into jQuery, so we can just call it, I'm using 400 milliseconds, so 0.4 of a second basically, to fade it out and then fade it back in again, right? You'll see the effect when we actually run it. So this is a nice reusable little routine. You'll find that we can stick it in and we can use it from all over the place. All we really have to worry about is passing the right values, and away we go. Questions about that? Okay. It's pretty self-explanatory when you read through the code, so I don't think it should be a major issue for anybody. All right, so now we have that, we can start thinking about how we're going to use it then. So coming back to the patient controller, this is kind of why, early on in the course, I seem to be doing something that you might have questioned is, why are we even bothering? Let me go Control-MO, shrink everything down. Just make it easier to scroll up and down and find the different parts. Okay, remember we had this twist on the populate drop-down list approach, right? Creating separate methods that return the select list separately from the one that adds it all to the view data, right? So we had separate here, doctor select list, medical trials select list, and then we would call populate drop-down lists, okay? And this would use the other individual ones here, for just returning the select lists, right, to add the information into view data. And that was all necessary, of course, to get into view data so that when we display the view, okay, the data is there to populate our selects, our drop-down lists, right? So why did I ask for this extra step to break it out separately so we can just ask for the select lists? Well, now you'll finally really understand why I did that, okay? It wasn't that I was trying to be a Grinch and ask for extra work. Because what we're going to do here now is I'm going to throw in a little method here. I'm going to call it get medical trials. Notice the type. It is a JSON result. Now, I think everyone by now is familiar with JSON, JavaScript object notation. It's one of the ways of describing data in a text format, okay? XML is the other most popular one out there, but JSON, a lot of people prefer it because, well, for one thing, it takes a lot less characters, right? XML, you have your opening and closing tag around every piece of information. And so you don't actually have to have as many characters when you put it together in JSON format. But it's still just a text-based format to bundle up data, and it supports a hierarchical data structure as well, right? So this method we're adding to the patient controller, get medical trials, okay, will just return data in JSON format, right? Which is why you see when we return it, we take the data, okay, which is actually just the select list from up here, right? So it's a select list by passing it to this JSON method, right? It actually just serializes it into the JSON format and sends it back as the response. And of course, we have a nullable int for the ID, because remember how the medical trial list works, okay? In order to indicate which of the options in the select list data structure should be marked as a selected one, we pass this integer in, right? So that's all we're doing here. I have a nullable int ID, and we pass that on, and away we go. And so that gives us all the functionality, but the difference is instead of adding it to view data, so it's available in the view, we're going to return it directly to the request that came in for it. And that's how we're kind of going in the background, so to speak, to just go and get the data to update this one little aspect of the page. Okay, now there's a few steps involved for the next bit here. So we'll go through this and then we'll maybe take a quick pause. All right, so that's good. We have all the code in place we need back here, but we're going to have some components of the UI necessary for that, right? Basically, if I'm gonna work with medical trials as my example here, right? So if I want on the fly to be able to maybe have a little pop-up come up where I could enter a new medical trial, have it go off and submit this new medical trial and then immediately refresh my drop-down list, well, I actually have to have something to pop up, right? So I'm going to create a partial view. We've used them a number of times now. I'm going to make a partial view. I'm going to put it right. There's always the decision with a partial view. Do we throw it in the under views in the shared, right, or in a specific controller? Because remember how the routing works. It'll always look, if I'm working, say, for example, with the patient controller, it'll always look in here first. If it doesn't find it, then it looks in shared, right? Well, I can't see myself needing to use this from any other controller. So I'm going to go ahead and put it right in the patient controller. So I'm just going to right-click. We're going to add the view here, right? So it'll be a razor view. Now this time, actually, though, it is going to be to create a new medical trial. That's the whole idea. I'm making a form. I'm going to pop up, that comes a little later, to create a new medical trial. So I'll give it the name I want, underscore medical trial create. But I can say, no, it's not going to be empty. Scaffold it for me as a create. Okay, what model class? Medical trial. There we go, obviously from my medical office context, and make sure, though, that it is checked off that it's a partial view, right? Okay, so it's actually going to be quite similar to the existing medical trial create view, but there's a lot of things that we don't need, right? Like the headers at the top, links at the bottom, and so on and so forth, because remember, this is just going to be on the screen inside of a little pop-up. So I don't need any of this. You can take that out, okay? This heading business at the top, don't need any of that, right? Now, I am going to do some of my usual things. I always like to wrap the whole Bootstrap row inside of the actual form, right? And then, of course, got to move the closing form tag as well. And then my control craft inner, KD, helps me get the formatting in place. Okay, so that's, but it's basically the same form we had. So what else is it we want to do? Well, remember, this is going to be in that pop-up modal. So similar to some of the work we've done just recently, we're going to be using client-side JavaScript. And that JavaScript is going to, for one thing, grab the submit event, right? Because we don't actually want this to submit because it's going to go off, right, to another controller, et cetera, right? So that's something we want to do is we want to change that. So, you know, we're going to add an ID. The ID makes it very easy for us then in our code, in our JavaScript, to grab the quick event and say, no, we're going to prevent the default, right? So I'm going to give it the ID, submit, medical trial create, right? Okay. I also need an ID in the form. That's not the only change to do in the opening form tag, but I'll start with that one, right? So the form, I'm giving it the ID, create medical trial form. But, see, it did this action. Of course, that doesn't even exist, right? That action. That's just the name I gave for my, partial view here. So we need to put in both, okay, the controller and the action, the proper ones that will actually do the job for us, right, of creating a new medical trial. So that means the controller would have to actually be the genuine medical trial controller, and our action will be the actual create action. So we're reusing the code for that part of the process that's already there, right? Okay, so we've changed the controller, the action. I've added the ID here to the form and an ID to the submit button, okay? Another thing I'm going to do, notice how it sets up, by default, it assumes we're just going to use 4 out of the 12, you know, Bootstrap column widths available on the screen. Well, this little form is just going to be up on the screen inside of a little modal, so I'm going to give it the entire width of that modal dialog box, right? And I think that's about it. Let me just review. Oh, no, there's one more important thing to talk about, okay? Because it scaffolded it, it put one of our standard validation summary divs up here at the top. I'm going to stop and pause for a moment to talk about that a little bit. See, we also, of course, have the span here, right, to add validation for the trial name, because we have it, it's a required string, right? So the good old client-side jQuery validation that is in place will actually get all the information it needs from the HTML that's added to the page based on this span. So it knows how to validate what's required, our validation error message, which of course really gets passed down from the annotation that we put on the actual medical trial class in our model folder, right? That all is in place on the client side, ready to do the client-side validation. Never really talked about it much before, but the validation summary, this div at the top, if there are no validation errors, nothing actually is sent down to the client, right? When the page is loaded in the client browser, this isn't even mentioned. There's nothing there for the actual validation summary, okay? So that's okay if you're just actually going to display the view directly in response to an action in the controller, but that's not going to be our case. Remember, we're taking this form out of the normal flow of control of our MVC application. We're going to work directly between it and the controller in the background without refreshing the page. So we will never actually see this appear, right? So instead, I'm going to take that out. But if you ever go in, just view source on any page if there is a validation summary showing, and you'll see what kind of HTML is actually generated in the page. And basically, okay, it is a unordered list, right? And then every error message becomes a list item. So the validation summary is set up to show multiple error messages, right? Which makes sense because we've seen that we can add multiple view model errors, right? And they can all be displayed listed one after another. So what I'm going to do is I'm putting in basically the HTML version of a validation summary. And notice I'm even using the exact same class, so it will look and appear with the same red and everything else is set up the same way as a regular validation summary. But this is always going to be there in the page, and I've given an ID to my unordered list. So again, in our client-side JavaScript, I'll be able to manipulate this and use it to show any error messages that I want to show, right? This one will happen automatically, and we're going to see that, okay? Because everything is already downloaded on the client to do the client-side validation. Bada bing, bada boom, that's taken care of for us. But we're going to manually add any list items to this unordered list, for one for every error message that we're going to have returned from the controller. So that's it. So other than that, other than those, 7 things that I've changed, it is basically the same as the create form that we already had. Any questions about that form? Okay. All right. So I want to host this in a modal, and I find it's cleaner to actually do that in a separate partial view. So I'm going to right-click. We're going to add another view. Okay. This time I'm not going to use any model. I'm just going to put the code in place. It's very similar to the other examples we've done where we actually have a bootstrap modal, right? So I'm going to call it my add medical trial modal. And it's just using our modal dialog, bootstrap modal dialog, right? So we have the content, the header, the body. I'm not even putting anything in a footer here at all, right? Okay, so it just has the proper IDs and everything else, so I can easily activate it later on, okay? But notice inside here, here's the header. So I actually have this text, add new medical trial. This is my little X button in the upper right-hand corner, which has the bootstrap dismiss, right? So it has the function of closing the modal if I just click the X in the upper right corner. Inside the modal body, inside my Razor code, notice I'm doing something a little different, right? Yeah, I'm saying partial. Here's the name of my medical trial create, right? Partial But look at this. I'm passing a model, right? Most of our partial views we've created are what you would call, well, not strongly typed views, right? They don't have a model. But this one does. It actually has a model at the top here. It's one of our medical trial database models, right? That's our class, okay? So I'm going to new up, basically, a medical trial and pass that as the model to the view. All right. Okay, now how do we get this in place in the page? Well, I'm going to do this on both the patient. Remember, although we're talking about adding medical trials here, this is all going to be done while we're creating or editing a patient, right? So those are the two views that I need to go to. Patient here, create and edit. And in both of them, I'm going to add the link for the partial view, okay, for my add medical trial modal. Now, something to emphasize, notice I'm putting it above the form, because this actually will eventually contain a form. You cannot have a form inside a form, okay? It just leads to problems. So that's one reason. Be very careful. Make sure that when you add the code for your partial view, you do it somewhere, right, that is not inside the actual form used by the page itself. Okay. All right. And then to trigger the modal, okay, well, that's the kind of thing we've done before, except I'm going to use an input group, right? We've had buttons before you click to bring up a modal, right? But we're going to do it a little bit differently here. Let me come down to where our select control is. Here's our select for the medical trial. Notice we do have our option value of none and so on and so forth, okay? All right. Well, we're going to leave that much alone. Even the label could stay the same, okay? But instead of just having the select, I'm going to throw it inside of an input group. An input group allows us to combine inputs together into a single group. Actually, you know what? I'm going to replace the code. Well, tell you what, so we can compare, I'm just going to put it in underneath, and then we'll eventually remove the old version, right? So you can see the difference there now. We've defined an input group, and so this div is of class input group prepend. In other words, it's going to be sitting in front of the other input, right? So the actual select is exactly the same as it was, okay? ASP4, medical trial ID, et cetera, right? And so on, okay? There's no change to that, but we're prepending or putting in front of it a little button here, right? I'm giving it a class button outline secondary, giving it an ID, now add medical trial, okay? Look at that. It's a bootstrap toggle. The target is, that's the modal, right? That's in my partial view, okay? My add medical trial modal. So we can click this button, okay, to bring up the modal. Now, I'm using a Unicode character for a nice big plus sign. You know, if you don't want to use a Unicode character, you can just use a plus sign, right? But I would probably throw the HTML tags strong around it to help make it a bit bigger and bolder. But, you know, the Unicode character works nicely as well. Okay, so that's basically what I have to do here. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'll take out this one now, right? I don't need both. Oh, what did I do wrong? I didn't select the whole thing. There we go. All right. So this time I'll actually replace it. So on the create, I'll just replace the div with this new version. Oh, control. Why is it? Sometimes it just doesn't want to work for me. There we go. All right. That gets the job done, one way or the other, right? Okay, I'm going to actually run it now. Now, let me draw your attention. We haven't added the final component yet. That's the client-side JavaScript, but it'll give me a chance to show you something that's happening here. So I can do either on create or edit. It doesn't matter which one, right? Now you see my little prepended button here right in front of the medical trial, okay? And when I click it, there we go. There's my add new medical trial modal inside the modal is my actual create form. And look at this, this even works, okay? Because that's all just client side that was already there, okay, in the standard way, okay? It's marked as required. We provided this message, right? It was right in our data annotation, right in the actual medical trial class itself, okay? But if I do put something in here, at this point in time, when I click create, what's going to happen? Anybody want to guess? There we go. Well, look at this. It went okay. It tried to go to medical trial create. Okay, notice that's the return URL you see up there. That's how the identity system keeps track. We were trying to go to this page. Now I have to log in because I should have taken time to comment out my authorized annotations everywhere, I guess. All right, well, I'll just log in. And then you see now it took me to the return URL, so it brought me to the actual medical trial create. This is not where I wanted to go, right? I didn't want to do this at all. I wanted to be still on the patient controller. So that's where we're going to take control of the click event of that submit button in our modal, right? And that's going to be coming up in the next part. But I'm going to stop and start the recording because this is getting a little bit long. Okay, so I'm going to stop it at this point.